A red and white cookbook once sat in millions of American kitchens, trusted without question. But some of its recipes did not fade with time. They vanished. No warnings. No explanations. Just dishes that quietly disappeared from family tables. Today, most people have never even heard their names. This matters because these recipes reveal how people once lived, cooked, and survived changing times. If they are forgotten, a piece of that history is lost with them. In this video, you will see 10 Betty Crocker recipes that disappeared from American kitchens and the real reasons they were left behind. Tomato aspic salad. It looked elegant on the table. Smooth, shiny, carefully shaped. But one slice was enough to unsettle anyone who tasted it for the first time. Tomato aspic salad was once a centerpiece in American homes, especially from the 1930s through the 1950s. It appeared in Betty Crocker cookbooks as a refined dish, often served at luncheons, church gatherings, and formal dinners. At a time when presentation signaled effort and pride, this dish delivered both. Suspended inside a firm tomato gelatin were small pieces of celery, onions, and sometimes even seafood. It was chilled, sliced, and served cold, often with a layer of mayonnaise on top. The appeal made sense in its time. Refrigeration was becoming more common, and gelatin dishes represented modernity and control. Families embraced recipes that could be prepared ahead of time and presented neatly. Tomato aspic fit perfectly into that world. It was affordable, practical, and visually impressive. For many households, it became a symbol of careful homemaking. But something about it did not last. As decades passed, taste began to shift. Fresh ingredients replaced preserved textures. People moved away from dishes that felt artificial or overly structured. The combination of savory flavors trapped inside gelatin started to feel unfamiliar, even uncomfortable. New generations did not grow up with it, and without that memory, there was no reason to keep it alive. By the 1970s, tomato aspic had nearly vanished from everyday kitchens. It was not replaced by a single dish. It was replaced by a different way of thinking about food. Simpler, fresher, less rigid. Today, it survives only in old cookbooks and fading memories. A dish once served with pride now feels like something from another world, quietly left behind without a clear goodbye. Ham banana hollandaise. It sounded harmless at first. Sweet fruit, savory meat, a rich sauce poured over the top. But the first bite left many people unsure of what they were tasting. Ham banana hollandaise appeared in mid-century American cookbooks, including Betty Crocker editions from the 1950s and 1960s. It was presented as a creative, elegant dish, something that could impress guests at a dinner table. The preparation was simple but unusual. A whole banana was wrapped in a slice of ham, baked until warm, then covered in a smooth hollandaise sauce. Sometimes it was topped with cheese and returned to the oven for a final melt. At the time, this combination did not seem strange. American cooking was experimenting with contrasts. Sweet and savory flavors were often paired in bold ways. Convenience also played a role. Canned sauces and quick preparations allowed homemakers to create dishes that looked refined without requiring complex techniques. This recipe fit perfectly into that moment. It was easy to prepare, visually distinct, and carried a sense of modern creativity. For a while it worked. Families served it at gatherings. Cookbooks promoted it as something new and exciting. It stood out, which was exactly the point. But that same quality became its weakness. As food culture evolved, people began to favor balance over novelty. The combination of banana and ham, covered in a heavy sauce, no longer felt appealing. It did not match the direction that everyday cooking was moving toward. Fresh ingredients, lighter meals, and clearer flavors started to replace experimental pairings. Without strong demand, the recipe quietly disappeared. It was not adapted or modernized. It was simply left behind. Today, ham banana hollandaise exists mostly as a curiosity a reminder of a time when American kitchens were willing to try combinations that would not survive another generation. Perfection salad. The name promised certainty. Perfection, a dish that claimed it could not be improved. Yet for many who encounter it today, the first impression raises more questions than confidence. Perfection salad became popular in the early 20th century and remained a staple well into the mid-century era, appearing in Betty Crocker cookbooks as a dependable, refined side dish. It was built around clear gelatin, carefully molded to hold shredded cabbage, carrots, celery, and sometimes green peppers. A mild vinegar dressing gave it a sharp edge, while the gelatin held everything in a firm, uniform shape. It was sliced neatly and served cold, often alongside heavier meals. In its time, the appeal was clear. This was a dish that represented control, cleanliness, and order. Ingredients that would normally feel loose and unpredictable were held together in a precise form. It could be prepared ahead of time, stored easily, and presented with confidence. For families managing busy schedules and limited resources, that reliability mattered. It also reflected a growing fascination with food that looked structured and modern. For years, it held its place at the table. It was familiar, expected, and trusted. Then the meaning of perfection began to change. As cooking moved toward freshness and simplicity, dishes like this started to feel rigid and outdated. The texture became the main obstacle. Crisp vegetables locked inside gelatin created a contrast that many people found difficult to enjoy. Without the cultural context that once supported it, the dish lost its purpose. By the late 20th century, perfection salad had largely disappeared from everyday meals. It was not replaced by a direct alternative. Instead, it faded as taste shifted toward foods that felt more natural and less controlled. What once defined perfection now feels distant, a reminder that even certainty can quietly lose its place. Tuna jello pie. It arrived at the table already set, chilled, firm, perfectly shaped. But what it contained was not what most people expected from a pie. Tuna jello pie appeared in mid-century American cookbooks as a practical and inventive dish, often linked to the 1950s and 1960s. It used unflavored or lightly seasoned gelatin to bind together canned tuna, chopped vegetables, and sometimes cream-based ingredients. The mixture was poured into a pie mold, chilled until solid, then sliced and served cold. From a distance, it looked structured and appealing. Up close, it revealed a combination that challenged expectation. At the time, it fit the needs of American households. Convenience was becoming a central value in cooking. Canned tuna was affordable, widely available, and easy to store. Gelatin allowed meals to be prepared in advance, saving time during busy days. Recipes like this were promoted as efficient solutions that still felt complete and presentable. They represented a shift toward modern kitchen habits, where speed and structure were just as important as flavor. For a while, the idea worked. It was served at family gatherings, potlucks, and casual dinners. It offered something different, something that stood apart from traditional hot meals. But that difference did not age well. As food preferences evolved, people began to question dishes that relied heavily on processed textures. The idea of a cold, gelatin-bound seafood pie started to feel unfamiliar and unappealing. Freshness became more important than preservation. Meals were expected to feel natural, not constructed. Without a strong emotional connection to sustain it, tuna jello pie quietly disappeared. It was not reimagined or refined. It was simply left behind as tastes moved in another direction. Today, it remains a reminder of a time when practicality shaped creativity, even when the results did not last. Chicken divan, original version. It arrived hot, covered in a thick, pale sauce, with a surface that looked rich and complete. For many families, this was a dish that signaled effort, care, and a sense of occasion. Chicken divan became widely known in American kitchens during the mid-20th century, with versions appearing in Betty Crocker cookbooks. The original style was built from cooked chicken and broccoli, layered together and covered in a heavy cream-based sauce, often enriched with cheese or a condensed soup. It was baked until the top formed a golden crust, then served as a main course. On the surface, it felt simple. Underneath, it carried the weight of changing food habits. At the time, this dish represented progress. Ingredients like canned soup and pre-cooked chicken made preparation faster and more predictable. Families could create a meal that looked complex without spending hours in the kitchen. It also reflected a growing preference for casseroles, where everything could be combined into a single dish and served easily. Chicken divan fit perfectly into that pattern. It was warm, filling, and designed to feed a household without complication. For years, it remained a reliable choice. It appeared at dinners, gatherings, and shared meals where comfort mattered more than variety. But the original version began to fade as expectations changed. As people moved toward lighter cooking, heavy sauces and condensed ingredients lost their appeal. The texture felt too dense and the flavors too uniform. New approaches focused on freshness, where each ingredient could stand on its own rather than being covered and blended together. While modern versions of chicken divan still exist, the original form has largely disappeared. It was not fully abandoned, but it was reshaped to fit a different era. What remains is a reminder of a time when convenience defined comfort, even if that comfort could not last unchanged. Liver and onions loaf. It was served in slices, firm and uniform, arranged carefully on a plate. At first glance, it looked like any other loaf served at a family table. But the flavor told a different story, one that many people learned to endure rather than enjoy. Liver and onions loaf appeared in mid-century American cookbooks, including Betty Crocker editions, as a practical way to use inexpensive ingredients. Built from ground liver mixed with onions, breadcrumbs, and seasoning, it was shaped into a loaf and baked until set. It could be sliced cleanly and served with simple sides, making it both efficient and filling. At the time, the reasoning behind it was clear. Liver was affordable, widely available, and valued for its nutritional content. Families, especially during and after periods of economic strain, relied on ingredients that could stretch a budget while still providing substance. Transforming liver into a loaf made it easier to prepare and present. It softened the intensity of the ingredient and created a meal that could feed multiple people without waste. For many households, it became a regular part of the dinner rotation. It was not always loved, but it was accepted. It represented responsibility, not indulgence. Over time, that acceptance began to fade. As access to a wider range of foods increased, people no longer depended on ingredients like liver in the same way. Preferences shifted toward flavors that felt more familiar and less demanding. The strong taste and dense texture of liver became harder to justify when other options were available. Without necessity to support it, the dish lost its place. By the late 20th century, liver and onions loaf had largely disappeared from everyday cooking. It was not adapted or modernized. It was simply left behind. Today, it stands as a reminder of a time when meals were shaped by need, not preference, and that difference defined what stayed and what quietly vanished. Shrimp mold, 320 words. It sat on the table like a sculpture. Smooth, glossy, carefully shaped. But beneath its polished surface was a combination that surprised many who saw it for the first time. Shrimp mold became a recognizable dish in American entertaining during the mid-20th century, often featured in Betty Crocker cookbooks as a stylish appetizer for special occasions. It was created by combining cooked shrimp with gelatin, cream cheese, mayonnaise, and seasonings, then pouring the mixture into a mold and chilling it until firm. Once set, it was unmolded onto a serving plate and often decorated with herbs or additional seafood. At the time, presentation mattered deeply. This was an era when hosts and hostesses took pride in elaborate table displays. Cold dishes that could be prepared ahead of time were especially valued. Shrimp mold fit that need perfectly. It looked refined, required minimal last-minute effort, and gave the impression of careful planning. It was served at parties, holiday gatherings, and formal luncheons where appearance carried as much weight as flavor. For a period, it was seen as modern and impressive. It represented a growing interest in structured, decorative foods that could stand at the center of social gatherings. But that appeal did not continue. As dining culture shifted, people began to move away from molded dishes. Food started to be valued more for freshness and simplicity than for visual construction. The combination of gelatin and seafood, once considered elegant, began to feel unusual and outdated. Textures that were once impressive now felt heavy and artificial. Without a new generation embracing it, shrimp mold gradually disappeared from everyday tables. It was not replaced by a direct version. It simply faded as tastes evolved. Today, it remains a symbol of a time when food was shaped as much for display as for eating, and when presentation defined success at the table. Stuffed celery with pimento cheese. It was simple in appearance. Crisp green stalks, neatly filled, arranged in rows like they were meant to be admired before being eaten. But behind that simplicity was a very specific moment in American home cooking. Stuffed celery with pimento cheese appeared frequently in Betty Crocker-era cookbooks during the mid-20th century, promoted as an easy and reliable appetizer for gatherings. The preparation was straightforward. Fresh celery stalks were trimmed, washed, and filled with a thick mixture of cream cheese, shredded cheese, mayonnaise, and chopped pimentos. The result was a cold, crunchy bite that combined freshness with richness in a single piece. At the time, it matched the rhythm of household entertaining. Quick appetizers were essential for unexpected guests and planned social events. Ingredients were affordable, widely available, and required no cooking. It was a dish that could be prepared in minutes, yet still appear thoughtful and complete. In many homes, it became a quiet standard for parties, holiday spreads, and casual family visits. It also reflected the broader cooking style of its era. Simplicity was not seen as a limitation. It was a practical solution to busy schedules and limited preparation time. Foods that could be assembled quickly and served cold were especially valued, and stuffed celery fit that expectation perfectly. But over time, its presence began to shrink. As food culture changed, appetizers became more varied and less dependent on basic combinations. Flavors became more layered, and presentation style shifted. The idea of filling plain celery with a heavy cheese mixture started to feel outdated compared to fresher, more dynamic options. It was still edible, still easy, but no longer exciting. Gradually, it disappeared from everyday tables. Not because it failed, but because it no longer matched the way people wanted to eat. Today, it survives mostly in old recipe cards, a quiet reminder of when simplicity was enough to define an entire dish. Gelatin vegetable ring. It arrived at the table in a perfect circle. Glossy, firm, carefully unmolded so that every detail held its shape. But what it contained often surprised those seeing it for the first time. Gelatin vegetable rings were a common feature in American cookbooks during the mid-20th century, including Betty Crocker collections. The concept was simple but visually striking. Chopped vegetables such as carrots, peas, celery, and sometimes olives were suspended inside flavored gelatin, then set in a ring mold. Once chilled, the mold was removed, revealing a colorful, structured form that could be placed at the center of a serving table. At the time, this dish reflected a growing interest in presentation. Meals were not only about taste, but also about appearance. A well-made gelatin ring suggested effort, planning, and modern cooking technique. It was often served at luncheons, holiday gatherings, and formal dinners where hosts aimed to impress guests without complex preparation. The ingredients were affordable, and the method required no cooking after assembly, which made it practical for busy households. For a period, it became a symbol of organized home entertaining. It represented control over ingredients, structure and presentation, and creativity within simple limits. But as food preferences changed, its place began to weaken. The idea of vegetables suspended in flavored gelatin gradually lost appeal. People began to favor dishes that highlighted natural textures rather than combining them into molded forms. Fresh salads, roasted vegetables, and simpler preparations replaced structured molds. The visual appeal that once made it special no longer matched evolving tastes. Without cultural support, the gelatin vegetable ring quietly disappeared from most kitchens. It was not replaced by a single dish, but by an entirely different approach to food presentation. Today, it remains a frozen image from another era, when even vegetables were shaped to fit a perfect circle on the table. These recipes are more than forgotten dishes. They are records of a different way of living, where convenience, scarcity, and tradition shaped every meal. Each one reflects a moment in time when American kitchens worked with what they had, not what they preferred. Over the years, tastes changed, technology advanced, and these foods quietly disappeared without ceremony. What remains is not just curiosity, but perspective. Food history is not only about what we eat today, but what we chose to leave behind. If you found these forgotten recipes interesting, consider subscribing for more untold stories from the past.